There is a soil that does not exist anywhere else in the quantity it exists here. It is black, not brown, not grey, black, the colour of wet coffee grounds, the colour of something that has been alive. In places, it runs a full metre deep. Dig a pit into it, and you are not looking at dirt. You are looking at 10,000 years, layered, one season at a time. The people who farm it call it the Black Earth. The scientists, with less poetry, call it the most fertile soil on the planet. One country holds about a quarter of all of it. From that black earth comes wheat, corn, barley, sunflower oil. Enough in a normal year to feed 400 million people. Not its own people, other people. Strangers in Egypt and Lebanon, in Somalia and Bangladesh and Indonesia, who will never see this land, who eat bread baked from grain grown on soil they could not find on a map. This is one of the largest food engines on Earth. Quiet, flat, unglamorous. A country that feeds a tenth of the world's traded calories and asks for very little attention in return. And in the winter of 1933, on this exact soil, people starved to death by the millions. Not from drought, the harvest had been adequate. Not from war, there was no war. They starved because their grain was taken from them, sack by sack, house by house, and shipped away, while soldiers stood at the village edges and would not let them leave. The land that fed the world could not feed the people standing on top of it. Both of these things are true. The most fertile soil on Earth, the deadliest peacetime famine Europe has ever seen. They happened in the same fields, within living memory, and the distance between them is the distance you have to cross to understand this place at all. So how does the land that feeds the world become a land where people cannot eat? The answer begins, as it always has here, with the grass. This is Ukraine, 600,000 square kilometers, the largest country that lies entirely within Europe, larger than France, and almost all of it is flat. There are no real mountains here except at the very edges, the Carpathians in the far west, a low range on the Crimean coast in the south. Between them, for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, the land simply lies open. A plain at the bottom of the continent, tilted gently toward the Black Sea, drained by great slow rivers that have carried boats and armies and grain for 3,000 years. About two-thirds of the country is covered by that black soil. 65% of Ukraine is the most agriculturally productive land in Europe. Roughly a quarter of the entire planet's reserve of chernozem, the Black Earth, sits inside these borders. It is the reason this country has been called the breadbasket of Europe for as long as Europe has needed bread. It is the reason empires have fought over it for centuries. It is, more than the language or the borders or the flag, the thing that has defined what it means to live here. To understand Ukraine, you do not start with its cities, or its kings, or its wars. You start with the ground. Black Earth is not a gift. It is a debt the land paid to itself, slowly, over thousands of years, and it is still collecting on it. Picture this place at the end of the last ice age. No farms, no fences, no people to speak of. Just grass, an ocean of it, stretching from the edge of Europe deep into Central Asia, taller than a person in summer, bending in a wind that never quite stops. This is the steppe, and the steppe is a machine for making soil. Every year the grass grew, and every winter it died, and its roots, dense, fibrous, reaching 2 meters down, died with it. In a warmer, wetter place, all that dead plant matter would simply rot away on the surface and vanish. But here, The winters were cold enough to slow the rotting, and the summers dry enough to stop the rain from washing the nutrients out. So instead of disappearing, the dead grass was worked down into the ground. Earthworms pulled it under. Microbes broke it into a dark, stable substance called humus. Year after year, century after century, for 10,000 years. The result is a soil that can hold 4 to 16% organic matter, when most of the world's farmland struggles to hold 2. A soil rich in nitrogen and phosphorus, crumbly and well aerated, able to soak up the spring rain and hold it through a dry July. A soil so dark it looks burnt, so deep that in the heart of the country it can run 80 centimeters, even a full meter, before it gives way to the paler clay below. In 1883, a geologist named Vasily Dokuchayev came to the steppe to understand it. He dug pits, he measured the layers, and he arrived at an idea that had not quite existed before. That soil is not just crushed rock, not just dirt, but a living body, the product of climate and grass and animals and time, all working together. He gave the black earth its scientific name, chernozem, from the words for black and ground, and he founded an entire science around it. The study of soil as a living thing begins, more or less, in these fields. Dokuchayev understood with his instruments what the farmers had always known with their hands. 1 hectare of good chernozem will outproduce poorer land, even when that poorer land is drowned in fertilizer. The black earth does not need much, it simply gives. Which is exactly why people have never stopped trying to take it. Soil like this is rare. There are only a few great belts of black earth on the whole planet. The prairies of the American Midwest, the pampas of Argentina, the plains of Canada, and this one, the largest, running east out of Romania through Ukraine and on into Russia and Kazakhstan. Wherever it occurs, it makes a breadbasket. Wherever it occurs, it ends up feeding far more people than will ever live on top of it. The black earth is, in a real sense, one of the things that allow the modern world to be as crowded as it is. And of all those belts, the Ukrainian one has the longest record of feeding strangers. The Greeks bought grain here 25 centuries ago. Rome leaned on these harvests. The empire that ruled from Moscow called Ukraine its granary. Long before anyone counted 400 million mouths, this soil was already the place the rest of the world came when it was hungry. But the steppe that built this soil has almost entirely vanished. 300 years of ploughing turned the grass sea into the largest farm in Europe. The wild steppe, the original, untouched grassland, now survives in only a handful of small fragments. The largest of them sits in the south, near the edge of Crimea, behind a fence that has held since 1898. It is called Askania-Nova. A baron named Friedrich Pfalz-Fein grew up here on his family's vast estate, obsessed with animals. As a young man, he did something almost no one in his era thought to do. He fenced off a piece of virgin steppe, land that had never felt a plough, and left it alone. Then he began bringing the world to it. Zebras from Africa, bison from America, camels, antelope, ostriches. They arrived by ship and rail and were turned loose onto the Ukrainian grassland, and to everyone's surprise, many of them thrived. When the last Russian Tsar visited in 1914, he wrote to his mother that it looked like a picture from the Bible, as if all the animals had walked out of Noah's Ark. But Pfalz-Fein's most important act was quieter. In 1899, he sent an expedition to Mongolia and brought back a small, stocky, dun-colored horse with a stiff black mane that stands straight up like a brush. The Przewalski's horse. The only truly wild horse left on Earth, never domesticated, never broken, a living fragment of the Ice Age herds that once grazed this very steppe. Within a few decades, the Przewalski's horse went extinct in the wild. Every last one vanished from the Mongolian plains, and the animals that survived, the seed of the entire species, were the ones living behind that fence in southern Ukraine, and in a handful of zoos descended from them. In 1992, they were sent back. Horses bred from the Askania-Nova line were released onto the Mongolian steppe their ancestors had been taken from a century before. The wild horse exists today because a man in Ukraine decided, for no practical reason at all, to keep one corner of the world the way it had always been. The reserve still stands, but the war reached it. The fighting has rolled across this part of the south, and the people who count cranes and feed the horses have spent recent years doing it within the sound of artillery, with checkpoints on the roads and the steppe itself torn by trenches and fire. The last wild grass in Europe, guarded through a war it did not start. To stand in that grassland is to see what the whole country once was. There are creatures here that exist almost nowhere else. The saiga, an antelope with a strange, bulbous, drooping nose, an animal that looks assembled from spare parts, that has wandered the Eurasian steppe since the age of the mammoth, and is now critically endangered across its entire range. The great bustard, the heaviest flying bird in Europe, a male of which can weigh as much as a large dog, running across the open ground before it heaves itself impossibly into the air. In the soil itself live the ground squirrels, the suslik, standing upright at the mouths of their burrows like small sentries, dropping out of sight at the shadow of a steppe eagle overhead. And in spring, the migration comes through, grey cranes in their tens of thousands, following the Azov to Black Sea corridor that has crossed this land since long before there was a name for it. And down in the grass itself, at the scale most people never bother to look, the steppe is just as alive. A praying mantis sways on a seed head, perfectly still, waiting. Marbled white butterflies drift between the flowering herbs. Beetles work the soil that the grass is still, even now, in the act of making. Each one is a small piece of a system that has balanced itself over thousands of years. The same web of root and insect and worm and microbe that quietly built the richest farmland on Earth beneath their feet. This is the persistence the soil remembers. Not the wheat, which is planted and harvested and gone. The grass, the horse, the animals that were here before the plow and have outlasted nearly everything that came after. The rivers gave the land its first cities. The Dnipro, Europe's fourth longest river, falls out of the north, out of the marshes of Belarus, and runs more than 2,000 kilometers down the spine of the country to the Black Sea. For most of human history, in a land with no mountains to cross and few roads to follow, the river was the road. And where the river bent, the cities grew. More than 1,000 years ago, on the high western bank of the Dnipro, a city rose that would become one of the most important in the medieval world: Kyiv. By the 11th century, the state ruled from here. Kievan Rus was among the largest in Europe. Its princes married into the royal houses of France and Byzantium. Its scribes copied books in a new alphabet. And in 1037, its rulers raised a cathedral, St. Sophia, with 13 domes and walls covered in gold mosaic and fresco, much of which still survives. Nearly 1,000 years of incense, invasion, and prayer beneath the same ceiling. Not far from that cathedral, the hillside above the river is hollow. Beneath the gold domes of the Kyiv Pechersk Lavra, the monastery of the caves, runs a network of narrow tunnels dug by monks nearly 1,000 years ago. In the cool dark, the bodies of saints and ascetics lie where they were laid centuries ago, naturally preserved, drawing pilgrims who still descend with thin candles to pray in passages barely wide enough for one. It is one of the holiest sites in the Orthodox world. It has survived, like the city above it, very nearly everything. Kyiv has been sacked and rebuilt more times than most cities have existed. The Mongols burned it to the ground in 1240. It has been ruled from Vilnius, from Warsaw, from Moscow, and from no one but itself. It is one of the oldest continuously inhabited capitals in Europe, and it has spent most of those centuries belonging, on paper, to someone else. This is the pattern that repeats everywhere in this country. The land is too valuable to be left alone and too large to be fully held. So it is taken and taken again, and somehow the people on it remain. Out of that pattern came a particular kind of people. In the 15th and 16th centuries, the open steppe in the south and east was a dangerous frontier, a no-man's land between settled Europe and the raiding empires beyond. The people who chose to live there had to be able to farm and fight in the same season. They organized themselves into self-governing brotherhoods of warriors, elected their own leaders, and answered in theory to no king at all. They were the Cossacks, and their stronghold on a fortified island in the rapids of the Dnipro was called the Zaporizhian Sich. The Cossacks became the closest thing the steppe had to a free society, armed, mobile, fiercely independent, bound by their own code. In 1648, their leader, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, raised a vast revolt that broke Polish control over much of the land and created for a time a Cossack state of their own. For Ukrainians, the Cossacks are the root of a national idea, that the people of the Black Earth answer to themselves. You can still see that idea stitched into cloth. The vyshyvanka, the embroidered shirt, is worn across Ukraine, and the patterns change from region to region. Red and black thread through the center of the country, geometric crosses and trees of life and protective symbols repeated by hand the way they have been for centuries. The Cossacks are said to have worn them into battle as a kind of armor, not against blades, but against fate. Every line in the embroidery means something: a square for the earth, a field, a circle for the sun, a tree for the family, the generations, the root. It is a quiet form of memory, a way of carrying who you are on your own body in a place where almost everything else could be taken from you. The same impulse shaped the way Ukrainians have always marked the turning of the year. In spring, before Easter, they make the pisanka. It is an egg, written rather than painted. The word comes from pisati, to write, drawn line by line in hot beeswax with a fine stylus, then dipped through dye after dye, light to dark, the wax holding back each color until the very end, when it is melted away to reveal a design built up in layers no single glance can take in. The patterns are the same ancient symbols found in the embroidery. The egg itself is a prayer, kept in the home for protection, given as a gift, never eaten. And at a wedding, there is the korovai, a great round bread, braided and decorated with dough birds and sheaves of wheat, baked from the grain of the black earth and shared among the guests. In a culture built on soil and harvest, bread is not just food. It is the center of every threshold, every blessing, every welcome. The land even shaped the country's poetry. In 1814, a boy named Taras Shevchenko was born a serf, the property, by law, of a landowner, like millions of other peasants tied to these fields. He was bought out of bondage as a young man because of his gift for drawing, and he became a painter, and then something more. He wrote in Ukrainian, the language of the village and the field, at a time when the empire treated it as a peasant dialect unworthy of literature. His poems gave the people of the Black Earth a voice for their own land, their own grief, their own dignity. He is, to this day, the closest thing Ukraine has to a founding father, a man born owning nothing, not even himself, who gave a nation its words. Those words traveled by a strange route. For centuries, the history of the steppe was carried not in books, but in song, by blind, wandering minstrels called kobzari, who moved from village to village with a stringed instrument called the bandura, singing the old epics of Cossacks and captivity and the land. They were a living library, walking the country on foot. In the 1930s, the Soviet state is said to have gathered many of them together and silenced them, the way one might burn an archive, because a people who remember their own story are harder to rule. Far to the west, the flat land finally rises. The Carpathian mountains curve through the corner of the country, not high by the measure of the Alps, topping out at Haverla, just over 2,000 meters, but old, rounded, and covered in forest. And in these mountains grow some of the last primeval forests in Europe. Stands of beech that have never been logged, where trees have fallen and rotted and risen again in the same place for thousands of years, untouched. They are protected now by UNESCO, a remnant of the great wildwood that once covered the continent. Things live here that vanished from most of Europe long ago. The European bison, the zuba, the largest land animal on the continent, a shaggy, massive survivor that was hunted to extinction in the wild in the early 20th century. Every European bison alive today descends from a few dozen animals kept in captivity, bred back from the edge, and released again into forests like these. Lynx move through the beech shadow. Brown bears still den in the high valleys. Wolves still run the ridgelines, the same wolves that have always run them. And in the villages folded into these mountains live the Hutsuls, a highland people with their own dialect, their own music, their own bright woven dress, who herd sheep in the high meadows and carve and embroider through the long winters, keeping a way of life the lowlands gave up generations ago. Their festivals still follow the old calendar. At midsummer, on the night of Ivana Kupala, young people still leap over bonfires and float candlelit wreaths down the rivers, a rite older than the churches that tried to replace it. At the foot of the mountains sits Lviv. For centuries, Lviv looked west, not east, ruled by Poland, then by the Habsburg Empire from Vienna. And it still wears that history in its streets, a cobbled old town that survived the wars largely intact. Cafes where the coffeehouse culture of Central Europe never died. Churches of half a dozen denominations within a few blocks of one another. Lviv is the cultural heart of Western Ukraine, a city that feels like a door between two halves of the continent, and a reminder that this country has never been a single, simple thing. It has always been a meeting place of empires, of faiths, of East and West, held together, in the end, by the land beneath it all.
For most of the last 3 centuries, all of this,
The soil, the rivers, the cities, the people, was ruled from somewhere else. Ukraine spent generations as a province of larger empires, its language discouraged, its grain claimed, its name treated as a region rather than a nation. Then, in 1991, as the Soviet Union dissolved, Ukrainians voted overwhelmingly for independence, and a country that had existed in the heart for centuries finally existed on the map. It was, in historical terms, very new. The land beneath it was very old. The distance between those two facts explains a great deal about everything that has happened since. Between the mountains and the sea, the country is stitched together by water and stone. The Dnipro is dammed in a chain of vast reservoirs that light the cities and turn the turbines of a nation. In the southwest, the Danube, the great river of Europe, finally reaches the end of its journey, splitting into a maze of reeds and channels and lagoons before it empties into the Black Sea. The Danube Delta is one of the largest wetlands on the continent, a place of pelicans and herons and half the bird species in Europe. To the north, along the border with Belarus, lie the Pripyat marshes, a flooded forest the size of a small country, the largest wetland in all of Europe, where the land and the water have never fully agreed on a boundary. And beneath the black earth lies a second fortune. In the east, around the city of Kryvyi Rih, sit some of the largest iron ore deposits on the planet. Nearby is one of the world's great reserves of manganese. The Donbass, in the Far East, was built on coal. For more than a century, this combination, black soil above, black coal and iron below, made Ukraine one of the most valuable pieces of ground in Eurasia, a land that could feed you and arm you at the same time. It is no accident that this is the most fought-over corner of Europe. There has rarely been more here worth fighting for. You can read the layers of that history in a single town. In the southwest stands Kamianets-Podilsky, a small city built inside a loop of River Canyon, ringed on 3 sides by sheer rock walls, guarded by a stone fortress that has changed hands among Poland, Turkey, and a dozen other powers. In the south, the Tavria steppe rolls down toward Crimea, the warm peninsula reaching into the Black Sea that has been prized and contested since the days of the Greeks. Kyiv in the northeast, Dnipro on its great river, Odessa on the coast, each a city with its own century, its own rulers, its own scars. No single story holds them all, only the ground does. The far south tells its own version of the country's story. For most of its history, the steppe near the Black Sea was too dry to farm reliably, fertile soil, but not enough rain. So in the 20th century, engineers cut a great canal across the land, carrying Dnipro water more than 400 kilometers south, and turned the arid Tavrian plain and the northern part of the Crimean Peninsula green. Fields of grain, orchards and melons appeared where the grass had always burned brown by July. It was an enormous act of will, the deliberate watering of a near desert to make it feed people. But the people who had lived longest on that peninsula were no longer there to see it. The Crimean Tatars, the Muslim people native to Crimea for centuries, were deported in their entirety in 1944, loaded onto trains over a matter of days, and shipped to Central Asia, where many thousands died on the way or soon after. It would be nearly half a century before they were allowed to return. The pattern is by now familiar. A people removed from the land kept, the harvest gathered by someone else. And in the north, there is a place where the people left and the wild came back. On the 26th of April, 1986, a reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explodes during a botched safety test. It is the worst nuclear accident in history. A radioactive cloud drifts across Europe. In the days that follow, the authorities evacuate the city of Pripyat and the towns around it. Tens of thousands of people told to pack a single bag for 3 days, who never come home. A zone the size of a small country is sealed off and abandoned. And then something happened that no one had planned for. With the people gone, the animals returned. The exclusion zone, poisoned, forbidden, deadly to live in, became by accident one of the largest wildlife refuges in Europe. Wolves prowl the empty streets. Wild boar root through the floors of abandoned houses. Elk and deer move through the forest, reclaiming the fields. And in a final, strange echo, a herd of Przewalski's horses, those same Ice Age wild horses, was released into the zone in the late 1990s, and they thrive there still, grazing among the dead buildings in the one place on the continent where humans are the danger and the animals are safe. The radiation is real. The harm to the wildlife is debated and almost certainly present. But the larger truth is hard to argue with. Remove the people, and the land does not die. It fills back up with life almost immediately, as if it had only been waiting. It is the same lesson the steppe teaches, written in a darker hand. This ground wants to be alive. It takes a great deal of effort to stop it. But effort is exactly what this land has always received. For most of the year, the Great Plain in the center and south is given over entirely to crops. In high summer, it turns gold, not with wheat alone, but with sunflowers, millions of them, turning their heads through the day to follow the light. Ukraine is the largest producer of sunflower oil on the planet. More than half of all the sunflower oil traded in the world is pressed from seeds grown in this soil. The flower has become, in recent years, a symbol of the country itself, bright, common, rooted, and impossible to ignore. The numbers are hard to hold in the mind. In a strong year before the war, Ukraine harvested more than 80 million tons of grain. It ranked among the top handful of exporters on earth for wheat, for corn, for barley, for rapeseed. Its corn fed livestock in China and people across the Middle East. Its wheat became bread in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Yemen, in Bangladesh. Countries that imported the majority of their grain, much of it from here. 36 nations relied on this region for more than half their grain. This is what it means to feed 400 million people. It is not a slogan. It is a logistical fact, repeated every harvest, mostly invisible to the people it keeps alive. The farming that produces all of this is not the farming of a postcard. Much of the Black Earth is worked at enormous scale, single holdings, tens of thousands of hectares across, run by agricultural companies with their own silos, their own rail cars, their own fleets of combines that move through the wheat in formation like ships at sea. One Ukrainian agribusiness can farm an area larger than some countries. The harvest pours off these fields into a chain engineered to never stop. Truck to silo, silo to rail, rail to river barge, barge to the ports. And alongside the giants, the old way persists. In thousands of villages, families still keep a garden plot. a few rows of potatoes and beans and sunflowers, a cow, a handful of chickens. It is the small agriculture that has fed people through every collapse the larger system has suffered. When the silos are blockaded and the markets fail, it is the village plot that keeps a family eating. The black earth feeds the world at the top and the household at the bottom, and it has always done both at once. Which makes what happened in 1933 even harder to comprehend. By the early 1930s, this land belonged to the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had decided to remake the countryside by force. The plan was called collectivization. Peasants who had farmed their own plots for generations were ordered to surrender their land, their tools, and their animals to large collective farms run by the state. Those who resisted, and Ukrainians resisted more than most, were labeled enemies. The wealthier farmers, the ones with a few extra cattle, were branded kulaks, stripped of everything, and deported or killed. Production collapsed, as it always does when you take the land from the people who know it. But the state's answer to the shortage was not to ask for less, it was to demand more. In 1932, Moscow sets grain quotas for Ukraine at levels the land cannot possibly meet. When the villages cannot deliver, brigades of party activists are sent in to take it anyway. They search homes. They drive long metal rods into the ground and into the haystacks, hunting for hidden grain. They confiscate not just the wheat, but the seed grain, the beans, the potatoes, the last food in the house. A law is passed that makes taking even a handful of grain from a state field a capital crime. People are shot for gleaning the stalks left in their own fields after the harvest. And then the borders of the villages are closed. People were forbidden to leave in search of food. Travel passes were denied. The starving were trapped in place, in their own homes, in the most fertile farmland in Europe, with the food removed and the exits sealed. What followed, through the winter and spring of 1933, was death on a scale that is almost impossible to describe, and was, for decades, almost impossible even to say aloud. In the villages, people ate grass, bark, leather. They swelled with hunger, and then they died. In their homes, in the roads, in the fields. By the time it ended, somewhere between 3.5 and 5 million people had starved to death in Ukraine. A quarter of them, by some counts, were children. It is called the Holodomor, from the words for hunger and extermination. Death inflicted by hunger. The most damning fact is the simplest one. There was grain. During the very months that Ukrainians were starving, the Soviet Union exported more than 1 million tons of grain abroad, selling the harvest of the black earth for foreign currency, while the people who grew it died on top of it. The famine was not a failure of the soil. The soil did everything it always does. The famine was a decision. The world was told mostly that nothing was happening. In the spring of 1933, a young Welsh journalist named Gareth Jones slips away from his official minders, gets off a train in the Ukrainian countryside, and walks from village to village on foot. He sees the empty houses. He talks to the starving. He writes it all down, and when he reaches the West, he holds a press conference and tells the world plainly, "There is famine in Ukraine, and it is man-made." He was called a liar. The most respected Western correspondent in Moscow, a man who had won the Pulitzer Prize for his reporting, publicly dismissed Jones's account and assured the world there was no famine, that the reports were exaggeration. The denial held. The grain kept moving, and Gareth Jones, who had told the truth, was killed 2 years later under murky circumstances on a reporting trip in Asia, a single day before his 30th birthday. Ukraine has since recognized the Holodomor as a genocide. More than 24 countries agree. For 50 years, it could not even be named. The Soviet state denied the famine had happened at all, kept it out of the histories, punished those who spoke of it. The survivors carried it in silence into their old age, into their graves. Only after independence could the country build its memorial, a thin, grieving statue of a girl in Kyiv, clutching a few stalks of wheat in her hands. Only then could it finally say aloud what had been done, and to whom. Let that sit for a moment. The land that feeds 400 million strangers was made deliberately to starve its own. The same black earth, the same fields where the sunflowers turn, the most generous soil on the planet used as an instrument of murder. This is the contradiction at the center of the country, and it has never fully resolved. To see how the grain actually leaves this land, how the black earth reaches the 400 million, you have to go to the coast, to Odessa. Odessa sits on the northern shore of the Black Sea, a port city built in the late 18th century to be exactly this, the mouth of the breadbasket, the place where the harvest of the interior meets the sea. For 2 centuries, grain grown hundreds of kilometers inland has rolled toward Odessa and its sister ports by truck and rail and river barge, poured into towering silos along the water and then loaded into the holds of ships bound for the rest of the world. Roughly 90% of Ukraine's grain has always left this way, by sea, out past the Bosphorus and into the Mediterranean and beyond. Odessa itself is far more than a terminal. It is one of the great port cities of the Black Sea, founded under Catherine the Great, laid out by Italian and French architects, filled across 2 centuries with Greeks, Jews, Armenians, and a dozen other peoples drawn by the trade. Writers loved it. A grand stone staircase sweeps down toward the harbor, made famous 100 years ago by a single film. For most of its life, Odessa has been a place of arrival and departure, of opera and smuggling and sea air, a cosmopolitan window where the agricultural heartland finally meets the wider world. In an ordinary year, the scale is staggering. Stand at a Black Sea grain terminal in harvest season, and the air is thick with dust as an endless line of trucks unloads wheat grown in fields you cannot see from the coast. The grain is graded, blended, stored, and funneled into bulk carriers the length of a city block. From there, it crosses the sea in steel hulls, is milled into flour in distant cities, and finally appears, weeks later, as bread on tables in countries most of these farmers will never visit. This is the machine that feeds 400 million people, and in February 2022, it stopped. When the full-scale invasion began, the Russian Navy blockaded Ukraine's Black Sea ports. The ships could not sail. Within months, more than 20 million tons of grain sat trapped in silos with nowhere to go. Grain that hungry countries were waiting for. Global food prices spiked. In the poorest importing nations, in parts of Africa and the Middle East, the threat of famine moved closer, not because the harvest had failed, but because the harvest could not move. The head of the World Food Programme put it as plainly as it can be put. When the breadbasket of the world is taken off the market, the whole world feels it. For a time, a deal brokered by the United Nations and Turkey opened a corridor, and more than 1,000 ships carried grain out of Odessa and its neighbors. Then the deal collapsed, and Ukraine did something that tells you a great deal about this country. It opened its own corridor. Hugging its own coastline, under its own protection, it forced a shipping lane back open through a sea it did not control. The ports came back to life. The attacks continued, strikes on the terminals, on the silos, on the ships themselves, and the grain kept moving anyway. A trader on the ground described it almost wearily. The market has stopped reacting to the attacks. A strike on a port has become simply another one. Where the sea was too dangerous, Ukraine sent its grain the long way around. Convoys of trucks and trains carried it west across the borders into Europe, the so-called solidarity lanes, and barges pushed it down the Danube to Romanian ports and out through the delta to the open water. None of it was as cheap or as fast as the old route through Odessa. All of it cost more and moved less, and happened anyway. A country does not reroute the food supply of dozens of nations by accident. It does it on purpose, at great expense, because it has decided that feeding the world is not something it is willing to stop doing. By early 2026, despite all of it, the engine is still running. In the first 2 months of the year alone, Ukraine exported nearly 10 million tons of agricultural products, worth around $4 billion, with revenues higher than the year before. The harvest is smaller than it was. The war has taken land, taken workers, mined the fields, destroyed storage, driven many farmers into debt. The 2025 harvest came in around 50 million tons, well below the 86 million of the last peacetime year. And still, Ukraine remains among the top handful of grain exporters on the planet, top 3 in sunflower and rapeseed, 4th in corn, among the top 6 in wheat. Think about what that requires. Farmers planting fields within range of artillery, harvesters working ground that may be mined, ships sailing a blockaded sea, a whole country at war, choosing to keep feeding the world, not because the world is paying it well, but because this is what the Black Earth has always done, and stopping feels like a kind of surrender. The same soil that was used to starve a nation in 1933 is now being defended, ship by ship, so that strangers 1,000 miles away can eat. That is the answer to the question we began with. How does the land that feeds the world become a land where people cannot eat? The soil never changed. The soil is not the variable. The variable has always been the people who control it, what they choose to take and what they choose to give. The Black Earth does not care who owns it. It was here before the Cossacks, before Kyiv, before the first plough broke the first furrow. It built itself out of grass and patience over 10,000 years, and it will go on building itself long after the current borders are forgotten, the way it has outlived every empire that ever claimed it. The soil is the one permanent thing in a country where almost nothing else has been allowed to last. But the soil is not invincible. Even in peacetime, Ukraine loses an estimated 500 million tons of topsoil a year to erosion, the slow cost of farming the Black Earth too hard, the same mistake that turned the American plains to dust in the 1930s. The chernozem took 10,000 years to build. It does not come back on any human timescale. What is lost is lost. And now, the land carries new wounds, fields cratered by shells, soil fouled by fuel and metal, mines buried in the furrows that will take decades to clear. the most fertile farmland in Europe, scarred in ways that no single harvest will heal. No one can say how this ends, whether the ports stay open, whether the farmers can keep planting, whether the 400 million keep eating, or whether the breadbasket of the world is slowly taken off the table for good. The cranes still come through Askania-Nova in spring, the way they have since before there was a name for this place. The wild horses still graze the dead streets of Chernobyl. The beech forests in the Carpathians still fall and rise in the same ground they have held for thousands of years. And in the black earth villages, when the season allows, people still bake the round bread, still write the wax onto the eggs, still stitch the old protective symbols into cloth. The quiet insistence, repeated for centuries, that they are still here. Perhaps that is the only thing this land has ever been able to promise. Not safety, not peace, not even the certainty of a harvest. Only that the black earth is still here, still the most generous soil on earth, still feeding people who will never know its name, and still, after everything, worth defending. Thank you for traveling with us across the black earth of Ukraine, its grass, its grain, and its long memory. If you found something here worth sitting with, consider subscribing and stay a while. There is always more world to understand. Until the next journey.